We have an amazing guest here today who is one of the fathers of the field of conflict resolution analysis and theory building, and he's been a mentor to many of us, both physically and virtually. And we have the honor also of Professor Chris Mitchell doing the introductions, who is a father of the field in his own right. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Mitchell.
And it is true that Lou Kreisberg, who's an old friend and colleague of mine, we both go back a very long way, I think. I first met Lou when he was a visiting scholar at the London School of Economics, but I knew of his work well before, and I think the first thing I said to him is, why in heaven's name haven't they republished your book on social conflict, which they eventually did. And that must have been 1980. Well, never mind.
A couple of decades, or
yeah.
2 or 3, right?
So it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Lou to this meeting. For very many years now, he's been a scholar devoted to the development of theory and practically based theory which is based in reality in our field. He's written voluminously about the various ways in which one can think about analyzing conflict and not only analyzing it, but doing something about it. His textbook on constructive conflict resolution is ultimately, I think, one of the best books that we make our students read, or hope that they read. And one of Lou's specialities, of course, is looking at, or perhaps looking on with wonderment about what's happening in the Middle East with what we used to call the Arab-Israeli conflict, and we're now calling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's the topic of his talk today. We have a relatively new president, a relatively new attempt by the United States to do something about the conflict in the Middle East, which focuses on the Arabs, on the Israelis and the Palestinians. Lou has been looking on at this conflict for decades now, and I can't think of anybody better to give a long-term perspective on what Mr. Obama is likely to be able to do. So Lou, welcome. It's all yours.
The Bush administration policy on the Middle East, particularly to try to settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, obviously was a great failure. Whatever, and in fact, more than a failure, made things worse in many regards. So with the new administration, there was certainly reason to hope and expect that things would be better. And they are better. And they certainly started with some actions by Obama which indicate some sensibilities which are congruent certainly with the conflict resolution approach. The Cairo speech, which was open to listening, to be attentive, and be respectful. He began taking action immediately by appointing a special envoy, Mitchell, who had experience not only in Northern Ireland but actually in the Middle East, in chairing the committee that was investigating the Second Intifada. He met with American Jewish groups in the United States. That explains some new policy, and found that AIPAC did not contradict him, and he was kind of mobilizing this, seeing the conflict in a great, it's all of its complexity and in its context. But a year later, it's hard to say that much progress has been made in what was going on there. And so I think as people interested in conflict resolution say, well, is that inappropriate, the kind of approach that he took? Is it that he misused or underused what we think we know about how to deal with such problems? Or is the problem just so immense and so awful that there's not going to be any outside intervention that really is going to make much difference anyway? And I'm going to try to give some answer to those questions. Mostly, I've got my own agenda in this, so I'll tell you right up front. Part of it is to argue for a conflict resolution approach broadly understood, rather than the narrow focus on negotiation and mediation, but to look at this look at it from the point of how do conflicts get transformed so that the conflict continues, but in a less destructive fashion, with some sense of equity, of legitimacy on the part of the adversaries. So I have a paper which it's not available, but if you email me, if you want, I can email you the draft. I'm looking for comments. If you go to the Syracuse University Maxwell School faculty, you can find my email address. I'm not hiding, and I will be happy to be in touch with you. And in the paper, I do go to a little more about Obama and the administration and so on. But what I want to talk about today is really more about, so what could be done better? And have some very specific points. First of all, just in terms of taking conflict resolution narrowly conceived, are there things that might have been done or might still yet be done? I think one thing is hasn't been enough is to give some attention to what is positive about what's going on the local scene in Israel and in Palestine territories. I was in Israel in January, and I hadn't been for a few years. And my God, it's flourishing. Tel Aviv's more and more skyscrapers, more and more luxurious houses, more and more excellent highways. I went to Bethlehem through the wall. Bethlehem looked remarkably okay. I thought it was going to be pretty run down. No, busy market. It was on Sunday, but they said it was even busier on Saturday. People like it was flourishing. And one could see that as an obstacle as well as an opportunity. The obstacle is if things are going all right, so why should we change anything? And for the Israelis, there is some of that. It's not bad. But you could try to make it more positive. Look, there is so much possibilities now, even with the conflict. You people looking at it from the outside, you can make a go of these things. And if you work together, it could be even better. Instead of emphasizing painful compromises, as has been done, say, no, you have to, I think, present the future vision of what would be better. And I know that Paris sometimes has taken that line in these meetings. Not very honored for doing so. But I think there's a lot of evidence that is the way to go. There's a book edited by Zartman and Kremenuk on future-oriented agreements do better than backward-looking agreements, where they try to deal with the acrimonious past. And certainly there's much of that in the Israeli-Palestinians. They've got grievances and fears and mistrust. And if you try to just deal with those, it can be worse than trying to think about what could be done. And there are Palestinians who are talking more about this. The Prime Minister of Fayyad has been emphasizing economic development and infrastructure development and political development to begin building the state now, in process. There's no talk about that in the United States. It's amazing. You look in the newspapers. I don't know, how many of you have heard of Fayyad? That's good. But you'd think there'd be some attention to him. He's a darling of the West. He's saying a lot of the things we want to hear, but the American public is not very attentive. Then there's a matter of more social, emotional attention. To really do things to reduce the humiliation, particularly the Palestinians feel. I went to Bethlehem, which is it's right next to Jerusalem. I used to go down the hill, and people had relatives who lived in Gilo settlement in East Jerusalem, just down the hill, and then another hill, and it's Bethlehem. Now there's a wall, which is an ugly wall on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, it's wonderfully decorated. Restaurants have their menus posted, and there are all kinds of graffiti, and there are big pictures of it, and so on. But it didn't take long getting in somehow. But coming back, it took about 45 minutes to go through it. Now, I have an American passport. I went with somebody who has a Canadian passport. Israelis, Jewish or non-Jewish Israelis with Israeli passports would need special permission. So it's really cutting off. So it's a cuts interaction both ways. Those without from Bethlehem or from the other territories, some had special work permits, but they would put their hand on something which identified them. It was very slow. There was one guy there. I thought people in the line were amazingly good-natured about it, joking a little bit, and I was talking to his colleagues in English, and somebody explained that, yeah, well, during this 1 month they have special permit to go in, shopping and so on. And I then spoke later to Abdul Hadi, the Palestinian, and that was really remarkable. And he said, yeah, it's more of our generation. And he says, those of us in our generation, we swallow our humiliation. But the young people, they're angry. They're very angry. And it is the checkpoints, the whole demeanor of interaction is very humiliating, inherently, and there's nothing done to mitigate it. I had the idea that the Americans might do some counseling or consulting with the Israeli Defense Forces, security forces, on how to enforce laws without being provocative. It's a very important lesson for police. And enforce the law of the Palestinian and Jewish settlers in the West Bank who act provocatively and how that might be. We're doing that with the Palestinian security forces. How many of you have heard of Lieutenant General Dayton? Good. Okay. And he's been working in Gaza for about 4 years in leading the training of Palestinian security forces, training going on in Jordan, and they're been working out for a year or 2, 3 in Nablus and other cities in the West Bank. And they're vetted, of course, by the Israelis and by the Americans before they get the training, which you would think would make them questionable. Are they collaborationists? Are they just police working for the Israelis? And I hear different narratives about that, say one or the other, but basically they've been very well accepted in these cities because there were thuggish gangs and militias already beginning to operate fairly loosely and intimidating people, and that's gone now. And it's better for business that that's been done. But, as Dayton himself would say, does say, and as others that I spoke with say, that's okay for a year, but if after that there still isn't a Palestinian state, they will be seen as collaborations. So there are lots of, you say things are okay, but there are a lot of time bombs that are in place that if things don't get done better, they could deteriorate. And there could be more, in the social, emotional stuff, a little more attention to people exchanging some acknowledgement of the pains and fears of the other side. Apologize is really probably too much to try to get people to do, but some acknowledgement of how important certain places, sacred places, are to the other as well as to oneself. There's some interesting work done by Scott Atrin and others showing that when you try to bribe somebody for some concessions on something which they regard as sacred, they do think of it as a bribe. It's dishonorable to accept. It's hard to buy people off for something which they regard as sacred. And so couching it in other terms than buying them is an important thing to think of. And then there's just the whole matter of working on different levels. Mitchell has been working very much shuttling between the officials. A lot of people say there's not enough attention to all the other actors and what their engagement will be in the region and internationally. I was at the conference in Tel Aviv, and Ron Putnick said, when we were doing Oslo, we really worked with Egypt a lot. They're not using Egypt. They're not using a lot of the other things. And for all of Obama's multilaterality, on this operation, it's still, it's an American show, and everybody is a little bit standoff, and that's not enough. Okay, those are just some thoughts given a very more narrow perspective about what conflict resolution is about. I want to talk to a more broadly conceived notion, which deals more with structural factors, with longer-term perspectives, and there's also the point of, you need to do something that seems and is new and fresh. This seems tired. When the Oslo Declaration of Principles was signed in 1993, I and many people wept in joy. My God, they've recognized each other. It is going to happen. It will happen. It is happening. This is irreversible. I was at an interreligious group tour in December 1993. We went to Damascus, we went to Amman, we went to Cairo, we went to Jerusalem, and it was irreversible what had happened. There were some Palestinians said, this is not really a good deal. This is a good deal with Arafat, but not with the Palestinian people. But on the whole, this was glorious. And I still think it was a good idea, but it didn't work. It didn't work because of the way in which Arafat behaved. It didn't work because of some overzealous Israeli assassins. It didn't work for the inadequacies of the EU in overseeing what they were doing, and because of the Clinton administration letting things slip instead of being on top of it all the time. So it failed. And the Intifada that erupted in 2000 was a disaster. It was a disaster for everybody. It destroyed whatever peace camp there was in Israel, and people were devastated by it. For the Palestinians, it led to a total disaster. So, doing Oslo over again, the Oslo process over again, does not seem like a very encouraging thing to do. And this isn't quite like Oslo. Now they're going to talk about final status right away, if they ever get to talk. But it's still top level of negotiations, and that's the story. I think you got to do things that look a little fresher and start now. You don't wait for negotiations. You do things, and some things are being done, as I mentioned. There was an article over a year ago in Foreign Affairs by Mead saying, now start an international fund for Palestinian refugees. Just start it. You get different governments to come together, put up money, and start talking about compensation, resettlement, start doing it. Not say, well, when we do this, then we will do that. If you do this, just do this. Reduce some of the asymmetry, and not just promise it. And reducing the asymmetry does not require putting pressure. We usually think about, and even the Americans for Peace Now think, and a lot of Israelis say, if the U.S. government would just pressure the Israeli government, then it would be solved. Some kinds of pressure, and I want to come back to that at the end, we have to think more about what kinds of pressure work and are useful and what kinds are counterproductive. But it could also be done by other means, by strengthening the PA. The U.S. Congress has a ban on direct assistance to the PA, going on for years. Why would you not? Well, it's corrupt. You can't trust them. Well, if you want them to be legitimate, you want to strengthen Abbas, PA, the Palestinian Authority, give them some resources that they can dole out. I come from Chicago. I know how a machine operates. There's a little bit of corruption, but they didn't water the cement. They built things and it worked. But the Congress passed that legislation. It hasn't been, I don't think people are aware of it. It's done it. I spent a couple hours yesterday visiting a couple of members of Congress, or their staff people, just stopped by, a couple of people. It's interesting, talked about some of what I'm talking about. And the staff people are really not that, they don't know much about some of this. So that would be one thing. And they say, oh, that's interesting. The president can make exceptions if he authorizes them by claiming it's for national security reasons or whatever. It's necessary for us to do this. So he could just say, yeah, well, special grant to the PA. I've heard they'll talk of it. Then there's the problem of Hamas, which is really very serious. And without Hamas being part of the deal, it's hard to think that any deal could be trustworthy. And the Israelis would certainly not feel comfortable and secure, as Hamas was not, but they also will not talk to Hamas. And neither would the U.S. government talk to Hamas. So how do you get out of this? Interestingly, in doing some work on this paper, there are surveys which say that among Israelis, 50% of them say that they support talks with Hamas. would be necessary, you know, if it's useful necessary. 62% say they would have agreed to, they would support the Israeli government talking to a Palestinian unity government. Most Palestinians and most Israelis are in favor of a two-state solution. They just don't expect that it will happen. But they think that, of course, that's what it should be. So it isn't really all that impossible. And you could interpret Hamas's statements as opening in negotiations about what? When they say that they would have a 10-year hudna, ceasefire. Well, how about 15 years? How about 20 years? How about 50 years? You could talk. And if there were some signals to the Egyptians that, of course, the U.S., if there were some changes, some modifications, there would be some recognition. You know, we did that with the PLO when it was a terrorist organization, and Secretary of State Schultz did this as a gift to Bush. As he was leaving office, Schultz made, you know, there was, Arafat had to say these certain words, and he said some words which were pretty close, and they weren't good enough, and there was some more negotiating through intermediaries, and finally he said, close enough for Schultz to say, okay, that was it, it's done. And there was no big outcry. There wasn't a big screaming, oh, you recognize the PLO. It was done. Nothing much came of it, but that step had been taken. Eventually there was. So that's something that needs to be dealt with more than it seems to be being dealt with. There should certainly be more really multilateral work done. Turkey and Egypt have done some mediation. Some of that has faltered, and of course the Israeli foreign minister is not helpful. A man named Lieberman. When I was in Israel, the story broke about how the foreign ministry humiliated the Turkish ambassador to Israel. And everybody in Israel said, what were they thinking? Why would you try to do that? They had the ambassador come in and sit down on a lower chair, but the deputy, which was a higher chair, and the deputy told the Israeli correspondents, see, he is sitting in Hebrew, which the ambassador didn't speak. He is sitting on a lower stool. We have an Israeli flag here, no Turkish flag here. You see? And I'm not smiling. I'm not shaking his hand. You see? You take pictures. And when the ambassador understood later what was said, I've never been so humiliated in my life. This is outrageous. It took them 2 or 3 days until they apologized for that behavior. That kind of arrogant stupidity. Unbelievable. Anyway, so there's a challenge there to deal with that. And some multilateral behavior might be helpful. The Palestinian Authority applied for admission to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization does include other non-states, which have some economy. And most of the members were willing to accept the PA as a member. The Israeli government objected, and the U.S. government objected. So it did not happen. What is anybody's mind about that? Of course you'd want them in the WTO. You have another level of interaction, governmental organization overseeing this organization, their economic activities? I mean, that's what you'd want. Worried about corruption and this and that. So this is they're accepting rules by an international organization to oversee this. What's the point? But nobody's, I don't know, I just discovered this writing this paper, and I've been paying attention. So a lot of these things go on, and nobody much is paying attention except very quick. So I want to hear from you, but let me just conclude these remarks by talking a bit about implications for those of us in the conflict resolution community. I think we should work hard at thinking about plausible policy for specific actors. And I just kind of assigned myself to say, now, so what would you tell the U.S. government to do, the Obama administration? Now? And it was hard. It was very hard. What's plausible? I think I've uttered some things which are plausible. They're not completely wild. Correct. They're doable, and they're specific. I was very disappointed in a conversation I had with one staffer yesterday after doing a little lobbying for these. Started to try to do a little interviewing of him about other lobbyists. What about AIPAC and J Street? They did her talk to you. So yeah, AIPAC's around a lot. I know them, I have a relationship with them. J Street, I don't know. They've been here. They say they're not AIPAC, but I don't know what they're for specifically, what they want specifically. It was a little worrisome to me. If any of you have any contacts with J Street, pass it on. You've got to be more specific. It was really very disturbing.
Which office?
I don't know. I mean, I tried to call.
Which office was that Stafford?
That was Maffei's, my congressman. Dan Maffei. When I was coming down, I figured, oh, what should I do? I want to come here. I see some my friends, relatives here. A lot of people like, I don't know, maybe I call J Street. I don't know people at J Street. I called. There's nobody answers the phone. There's an automated answer. I called 2 or 3 times. Each time it says leave a message. I leave a message. Never got a response. They have no street address on their website. It's just a P.O. box. It begins to, what is? If any of you know what's going on, I'd like to hear. Anyway, for us in the field, we should try to think very specifically. It's a good exercise. And there are issues here that we don't enough talk about. I don't talk about enough. What about coercion? What about real pressure? We avoid talking about that. What about nonviolent action? How much do you think that's good, useful, necessary? How does that get built in? I have a sense that some of the nonviolent action which is going on by Palestinians is, try to stop and resist particular little actions, but it's not part of a strategy of what do we want? What is our position for a coexistence, for a living together? And successful nonviolent action requires, I think, that context. But I don't know, and I think we should think about it. And then there are fundamental issues about diffusion, and I've written a little bit about that elsewhere in the Berghoff papers. There's an ambiguity about, the dilemmas about what we're up to. We being the conflict resolution community, let's say. And conflict resolution is what we do, by definition. But we also want other people to adopt it, to use it. We encourage them to do it. Of course, if they do it, they're not really doing it because they're not really members of our community. They're politicians, they're diplomats, they're activists, they're other people. And when they do it, it's true that they end up, plucking little pieces, little techniques, little things, little words, and misusing them without understanding their context. Well, how do we deal with that? What is transmittable easily, and what techniques? I think attentive listening, it seems to me, is something everybody can use, and probably without too much damage. But a lot of other things, if you only take a piece of it and not see it in a larger context of mutuality and understanding that there is another side whose interests are meaningful and need to be attended to, and not see this only as a better device to get what you want yourself, it doesn't work so well. But I think that's another agenda item, my own and others, I guess. So I wanted to just put it on the table as well. But I really would like to hear what you think, and let's have conversations.
Yes, please.
Shimon Simon Wiesenthal Center, Paris. I'd just like to ask you a question. You talked about reinforcing the stakeholders, but on the other hand, there are also the spoilers.
Yes.
Iran, Syria. To what degree has the Obama administration's primary approach of engagement not confused and contradicted the reinforcement of the stakeholders vis-a-vis the dangers of the spoilers?
Well, I'm not sure I know what you're suggesting in the question. There are people who, it's hard to say what spoilers. We have a little group in Syracuse University on spoilers, and we've been, a lot of time has been spent on, well, what are spoilers? What are spoilers? Most of, many of them are ones who object to a particular deal, and they think a better deal is possible, and they want a better deal. And sometimes, in retrospect, they say maybe they're right. Maybe there was a better deal. There is a better deal. So it's hard to say. The spoilers is a way of like terrorists. It's the people who are doing the wrong thing. So, and something like Syria, it's hard to know what, I don't know what the Syrian government wants. I think that they're opportunistic. And they want to stay in power. They're nervous, and I don't know. But do they really oppose any two-state solution? I don't know. They probably not. They probably accept it. Do they want? They want to be a hegemonic fake, player. Jordan, Lebanon, I don't see that. The problem is, what you're suggesting is that, do we always try to use engagement in a form of saying, well, what do you want? We're paying attention to what you want. And to what extent does that also mean that you could oppose somebody on specifics? What?
Well, in the case of Iran, for example,
yeah.
Iran doesn't want a better solution, surely. Iran does it want a solution? Or is it a spoiler of the entire policy? You spoke about strengthening Fayyad.
Yeah.
But I mean, Fayyad, there should be an entente, but with Fayyad regarding Iran, not apparent.
Well, Iran again, I don't know that it's so clear. Iran obviously has a lot of different factions. Who speaks for Iran? Does Ahmadinejad speak for Iran? Apparently not entirely, not all the time. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. So, and now it's even more and more clear that there are different factions. So the problem then is, governments deal with governments. Sometimes they deal with other factions as well, more covertly. I think that what Obama was trying to do with Iran was a good opening, because there wasn't much of an opening just to say, say nice words. I don't know that they could not be induced to acquiesce if the Palestinians and the Israeli government began to make a deal. I think they would be powerless to stop it. I don't think they would sic Hezbollah to start a war. And if the Israelis were smart, they could say, go ahead. We could ignore it. We can handle Hezbollah, and we can go ahead and make our deal. The terrible thing about spoilers is if you let them spoil it. You look at the ANC is a wonderful. What happened in South Africa is wonderful. You think, well, it was this. There were spoilers galore. There was this third force. There were blacks who were being paid by the security forces of the Afrikaner diehards, killing ANC people. There were people were assassinated, and de Klerk and Mandela just went on. They did not yield to that. In the Middle East, every goddamn time somebody blows something up, you say, "Oh well, we can't talk anymore." That's no way to behave.
Right.
I don't know.
I want to follow up on that, and then David after me. I want to like a dog with a bone. I want to harp on that point. If you want to go deeper into the spoiler issue, and you were sitting with George Mitchell, who had enormous experience at ignoring and co-opting spoilers, ignoring in certain ways and co-opting in others. And you're sitting with an infinite number of spoilers here, because let's face it, the settlers are spoilers. There are people in the government right now, in the Israeli government, that are trying to foment an intifada in order for them to not have to sit at the table, and the security forces, and so on and so forth. And then we have Syria, which if there's not clarity on giving back the Golan, they will be spoilers for sure. And they're saying clearly, say you're going to give it back and we're at the table. But until they hear that, they're a spoiler. And there's an infinite number. There's AIPAC and so on. So you're in this room with spoilers, and you're George Mitchell. And he did this in Ireland. We know the difference. We know that there was no lobby of spoilers in Ireland, in the United States Congress, but there is here. What would you do differently? How would you advise Obama, and what would you do to steamroll through the spoilers, co-opt, ignore, etc.? What kind of program is there for that? Does our field have any?
Well, that's well, that's what you support better police action. Some of these people do commit crimes. Violence should not be tolerated. So, I don't know. I obviously, I don't think you expect that I'm going to answer that question. I don't know. This is as far as I got.
What do you think we need to do in order to find out?
Well, I think we've got to think about...
Well, reframe it that way.
Yeah, I think we do have to think more about the role of violence. I think many of us are queasy about it. And we don't think it's a good idea. It's counterproductive, and that's true. But it's very prevalent, and it does have an impact. It can be very disruptive. That sometimes is the intention. And counter violence sometimes may be the best thing. But we're very reluctant to talk about that. Under what circumstances is some kind of counter violence a good idea? In the 1960s, there was a kind of romanticization of violence on the left, right? Che, great leader. And in Cuba, there had been this great successful revolution that a handful of people with Castro perpetrated by kidnapping some police, shooting somebody once or twice, and meeting with the New York Times reporters and so. And the Batista government launched this heavy repression. And in a little while, that he had isolated himself, and the revolution was successful. And Che said, that's the way you have a revolution. You create a revolutionary system. You go and commit a little bit of violence. You show that the police bleed. They're human. And then the government represses, and they create the revolutionary situation. And they went, he tried it in a couple places. It didn't work because the next government said, you know, Batista didn't handle that well. And they sent out police to deal, or soldiers to deal with particular acts. And they snuffed it out and changed it. Police action, which is precise and limited, can be effective. That's the whole debate about the war on terrorism. Should this be a war, or is this a police action? So these are ways in which you try to say that. Now, how much covert action of sabotage of the Iranian nuclear program you think should be part of the U.S. toolbox? Should there be more of it? Less of it? I don't know. But I think we should worry about it if we're going to try to be serious about these kinds of fights, because there are constituencies on all sides for the use of destructive or readily destructive methods. And so we're saying, well, there's a lot of other things you could do that are more constructive and will have better benefits for everybody, including yourself. But what are the limits of that? And I think more could be done of it, but I don't know if that's all that could be done. I'm stunned.
Dr. Mitchell wanted to add something, and then I'll go to David Alford.
Okay, do you mind if I join in?
Yes, because I used to.
Yes, I mean, we do have some ideas about spoilers, and I mean, John Darby, for example, looking at Northern Ireland, I think echoes your point a little about, just using the label conceals the fact that there are different kinds of spoilers that are spoiling for different reasons. I mean, I think if I remember rightly, he sort of pulls out sort of 4 basic types of spoilers, and then very carefully goes through in the sort of Northern Ireland context of what was done about 3 types. I mean, George Mitchell didn't necessarily use or advocate violence against all of them. He co-opted a lot of them. And so there isn't a blanket answer to what you do about spoilers. Spoilers spoil for different reasons. And it seems to me that one of the things that we ought to do is to sort of take some of John's ideas and elaborate them, but actually have a look at, get a list of actually who's objecting, and then try and find out why they're objecting, and then try and find out, okay, what do they want that would actually bring them on board, and we can sort of co-opt them. Now, what they want may actually be out of the question, But nonetheless, it seems to me just to sort of say, well, there are all these spoilers around. There are always spoilers around. And incidentally, they don't think of themselves as spoilers. They think of themselves as the last true repository of the true faith. So you have to sort of take that into account as well, you know, which means co-opting them requires a certain amount of sort of subtle flattery at the very least. Okay, but, I mean, you know, it's not a simple. There isn't a simple answer to the spoiler problem, because it's not the problem of the spoiler, it's the spoilers. You know, there are lots of them. So, you know, I think we do know a little bit about it.
David.
David Alpert from iCar, thank you. Curious about a couple of things. One term I haven't heard so far is occupation. That seems an interesting omission so far. And what that leads me into is a question about sequencing and procedure. As I talk with Palestinians, people in development organizations over there, one of the more common things that I hear is these efforts to make things better over here, to alleviate humiliation, agriculture projects, water projects, dialogue. This is wonderful, but in the context of occupation, what it appears that you're doing is making the occupation easier to bear. Please stop. Mm-hmm. And that's a very interesting, both a procedural and an ethical question for the field. Now, we have a situation where the Israelis are unlikely to, in general conversation about this situation, we tend to talk about this, that, the other thing, and then a two-state solution happens. And the Israelis are unlikely to allow anything like this unless there is this level of stability within the Palestinian side. The Palestinians, on the other hand, are arguing thus that in the presence of occupation, stop what you're doing. Stop trying to make this nicer. Stop trying to make it easier to swallow. So, sequencing and procedure, how would you go about this? I'm curious what you think about in what order you would address these things, because a lot of what you're talking about, what it's making me hear, as accurate and deep as it is, what it's making me hear is these conversations that I've had with the Palestinians, and what they're saying in the back of my mind is cut it out. Yeah. So I'm just curious, sequencing and procedure, what do you
Yeah, well, very good points. And it is there are a lot of dilemmas there. And they're different, you're indicating, the Palestinians differ about this. And of course, a lot of people just want to live. Just want some comfort. They don't care anymore. Just get on with their lives somehow. And there are others who say, you know, you can't buy us. You can't co-opt us. We will fight. And so on. You're just trying to, you know, buy us off. And that's what I say, that if you look like you're trying to bribe us, it would be dishonorable to accept it. That's a further humiliation effort. So there, for some people, what I'm saying would work. For others, it won't work. I wish that the Israeli government would have a different policy. This government is really retrograde. It's just terrible.
From where does the pressure need to come for this? Is that a governmental thing? Is it a community thing? Where do we start building? Because I wasn't sure I had a good answer for people in the field when I was talking. Well, I can understand the dilemma, but I wasn't sure I had a good solution to handle it.
I don't know either, but I think a lot of different things need to be done. I mean, you could say that which actor you want to define. I was defining it, the actor as the United States government. And that, of course, isn't solidarity either. There's Mr. Obama with his own preferences, his own inclinations, and surrounded by people that he chose who are old hats, who are, you know, who have very different views than I think his own preferences and inclinations might be. So, who is the U.S. government? Is it Hillary? Is it Mitchell? You're talking to people, some people say, yeah, it's all in Mitchell's hands. Mitchell's been delegated to it. Other people say, no, it's really Dennis Ross who's in charge. I don't know. So when I saw the U.S. government, that's a euphemism for a lot of different factions and people. I think what Obama started to do with the Jewish American community was a step. Say, you know, and I heard the stories that when Netanyahu came and went around Congress after that uncomfortable meeting with Obama, that some members of Congress said, the game's changed. Now, I don't know to what extent that really happened, but if it happened, if the U.S. Congress passed different kind of resolutions, that would be something. That would be, would that be pressure? Yeah, but that's just saying, you know, this isn't working for you. We love you. It's not working for you. You need to do something else. I know there's a bundle of things that have to be specific for different people.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, first, thank you for what you've done. I think some of the organizations I worked with have met you before over there, so we probably have met in person before. What you said is good, and I think what David said is very important too, because that is a lot of what Palestinian here is. It's a conflict management often what is been happening rather than conflict resolution, and that's where people have been losing a lot of hope. One thing I actually wanted to hear your opinion about, and it's a new change within the Palestinian politicians. Until 6 months ago, I was in the Palestinian embassy here, and one question was asked about the one-state, two-state solution. And the Palestinian government had a very clear answer that we only going to stick the two-state solution as a strategy. This is what we believe in. However, recently, if you've been following, Saeb Ariqat came up with a paper that says we are considering changing our position and moving toward the one-state solution, which until recently, even in the Palestinian streets, nobody has strongly favored that, yet it's starting to pick up. In America, it's a lot more, there's more speech about one-state and two-state solutions, and whether we're moving toward that direction. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think probably that conversation is a good thing to be going on. And I think, look, two states in that small area is really going to be very difficult. And it's very difficult to see how it would function. And if there were a little more creative thinking and a little more saying, well, borders are borders are borders are borders are borders, there are different ways in which they can exist. They be more or less porous and permeable. There are more or less ways in which particular places can be handled. You know, peace parks, or you know, a little thing with the Golan. There's a little piece of territory you make that's in dispute. Make it into a peace park. You know, there's shared. There's a lot of talk about different solutions to Jerusalem and different pieces of Jerusalem, the mount, the wall, the ground. Who has so any kind of conversation that would begin to say, loosen up the whole idea would, if it was used to say now there's either this or that, would be helpful. And I keep thinking, you know, Jordan really should be part of this picture. And I guess the Jordanians are don't want to really get involved, but at some level they really should be part of it. And so I think that more conversation about it would be helpful if it leads to thinking, trying to think freshly about peace, and even how this might work over time. The idea that there will be a peace agreement and that is the end is nonsense. There can be a treaty and it may not be implemented very well, which is so often the case. That's why I say you want to think of this in terms of conflict transformation. When does this shift, different ways of handling it, and what, it's ever changing. And you think of Belgium. How do they handle the Walloon Flemish problem? They keep changing the rules. They change the constitution. They change, that keeps changing. It's not final. Maybe it's drifting. I guess it's been drifting towards separation now for a long time, and I can't keep up with it. I don't know where it's at now. But that's a way of handling things. And this could be, you could even think of integration coming gradually. So that's all that I would say. Yes, let's talk.
Dan Rothbard, ICAR faculty. Thank you very much for your presentation and insights. I'd like to go back to your final comment where you were suggesting quite correctly that we all have a motive to transfer conflict resolution techniques to this crisis and multiple crises. And I would like to ask you what would you recommend for our field? And behind my question is an uncertainty for me. Is there really good evidence to know what kind of information, what kind of intervention works? You know, I mean, people, obviously in our field, many people are very focused and specialized in monitoring and evaluation, and we have people in the room here who do this. So is there good information to know what kind of intervention would work, and what would you recommend for this crisis?
Oh, I love these situations. I'm up here and I'm supposed to answer all these questions. I don't know. You know as well as I. Or better. The problem partly is that every situation is unique. You know, and of course the adversaries will tell you always that this is special. My fight is really different like all the others, and we know that. Well, that's true. It's unique, but it's like some others in some ways, and like all of them in some other ways, and so on. But when it comes to what do, it is in this particular situation. What does Mitchell say to Abbas on this day? What does he say to Netanyahu another day? I don't know. You know, at that level, I'm really not sure. And I don't think I could be, because it should depend on a lot of familiarity on the ground with a lot of stuff. And I don't have that kind of knowledge. So I'd be very hesitant. But I think what you have to figure, well, you know, in what other circumstances that they're somewhat like this, has been some more experience, and be very nuanced about it, because the probabilistic stuff isn't very helpful. I remember, I'm a sociologist, and I had a professor, Burgess, who was a bachelor, and he did studies of prisons, and he developed a very good predictive device for what parolees would be recidivists. You know, about 4 different questions you could ask. Were they part of the gang? Was it? And his index for predicting recidivism was very widely adopted. It had a success rate of about 60%, which is better than 50-50. So he went on and made up a marriage index. When people are going to get married, what would be the predictors of a good and long-lasting marriage? And he found what our good predictors were probably predicted about 60% of the time. Of course, nobody adopted it. Why would anybody adopt it? If you and I were going to get married, we know we're special. Whatever this professor's recidivism rate of marriage prediction rate is bullshit, you know, I don't want it. And that's what you're dealing with here. Even if you get a good probabilistic explanation, this will work in similar situations 70% of the time, 80% of the time. Doesn't mean that it will work in this condition. So that's one reason for thinking of it in terms of a general approach, and then saying, think about it in this general way, and you work on the detail. I'm not going to tell you what to do tomorrow.
Sure. Hi, Solon Simmons, professor at ICAR. A question in a slightly different register that I think you can answer. Unlike
all the other questions.
So, The idea is that, so what has been the distinctly sociological contribution to the field, if you would characterize it? That is, here at ICAR, I think I'm the only sociologist, formally trained sociologist here, and it's kind of, I always grapple with this problem, and this helps us in terms of the intellectual direction of the field. What is it that would be that piece that comes from sociology, in your view, that helped to make the field what it is and could help to make the field better in the future as we conduct our research?
Thank you. I think I've started to write that article a couple of times.
You need help.
Well, it comes to mind as an emphasis on interaction as being one thing. University of Chicago is important. And the idea how much is determined by interaction. And I like to say that about conflict. Every conflict is, nobody's in charge in a conflict. That's what it is, you know. And that means that instead of you being a victim, you've got a chance to change, because you can affect their conduct by changing your conduct. And that should be empowering. And I got it as a way of thinking about that for the adversary. One of the one of the things about the field that's troubling at times is that we emphasize so much about our intervention, and most of the evidence is it's usually not really all that important. It has some effect, and at certain times, circumstances, and the nature of the intervention, it can matter a lot. But most of the time, it's part of the something. But so you want to really think about what the primary actors are doing and what they're trying to do, and part of the intervention may be consultation with one side or the other, but understanding that you're looking at it from this particular perspective. But the other thing, I guess, in sociology is some emphasis on structure and large-scale factors, and the role and thinking about power. We were just talking to Kevin. He's writing about power. In sociology, the important thing is, from Max Weber, is that one kind of power, that legitimate power, depends on the people who give legitimacy, and if they withdraw that was Gene Sharp's big insight. Say, power depends upon people giving it to somebody. If they withdraw it, the person loses power. So I think that whole idea of looking at it in some of that complexity and seeing different levels of actors and a given interaction.
We're kind of knee-deep in engagement with J Street, engagement in Syria, engagement inside Israel, engagement inside Palestine. And there are hundreds of organizations.
Yeah.
And the best metaphor I can kind of find for what we're doing is a Bruce Springsteen title, which is Dancing in the Dark, in the sense that what you feel in the middle of it is that, borrowing from Plato's metaphor, is that it's a cave with absolutely no light, not even shadows, and some of us are hitting anything we can find, and some of us are embracing anything we can find. And we don't understand what's happening. After all of the theory, we don't understand. We know much better now about how to embrace, but we can't see anything. And one of the questions I have for you from past conflicts, from the ones that you've studied, the ones that you were very familiar with, is the issue, and Chris has studied this so much in his books, about linearity versus indirection, and the question of the course of progress or not. I have my suspicions that this is the worst conflict in modern history, because there are billions of spoilers. There are actually billions of people who are vested in Jerusalem in a way that was not true of Belfast, and that in some ways there's an intractability beyond any of our previous paradigms. But I don't know, because we can't tell, dancing in the dark, whether we're just doing the best we can and something's going to break out, or whether we're fundamentally without direction, and that there was something much better about the opportunity that Desmond Tutu and others took, or something much better about what the actors in Ireland did. I really can't tell, right in the thick of it, to what degree we're doing ingenious things and it's just waiting to happen, and to what degree it's just dancing in the dark, and something else much bigger is at work and we can't fix it. So I want to ask you about the people you've worked with in the last 40 years. Did they feel they were dancing in the dark, or did they feel the linearity? Did you see the light at the end of the tunnel in Belfast before it happened, or not, or did it feel like a tunnel? What are your impressions from past conflicts about this one?
Well, I think it may be, well, in reality, of course, you're right, that this one is very intractable, because the other ones proved to be not so intractable in the end. You know, the Cold War ended with a wonderful transformation on the whole. It could have been done better as it ended. It was a little exploitation, I think, by the U.S.
But we're still here.
But we're still here, and the Soviet Union, there were a lot of problems with it, and you know, in the long run, anyway, it allowed a lot of other conflicts to get settled. You know, it was now, and that would have, or you could see where that required a fundamental transformation in one side particularly, but that was assisted in some ways by the U.S. In many ways. This is very complicated, and I guess it may be more complicated because the intervention, both they're spoilers, but also protectors. I mean, you know, when it said, well, look, if the UN had not intervened in 1948, or the U.S. hadn't, you know, what if the war went on for another year or two? What would have happened? Would the result have been more unjust and more permanent? What would, in some ways, the intervention stops terrible things from happening, but it sometimes freezes it. And then if there isn't new action taken to unfreeze it, it just persists.
It becomes permanent.
There was some sense, I guess I knew some, well, there was Hendrik Vandermeer, who was an Afrikaan sociologist, who did intergroup work in Cape Town. And he said he was an Afrikaner and he changed. So he knew it could change, and he believed it long before it happened. And I guess my first sense that maybe it could happen was we had a little meeting many years before the change happened in Syracuse about South Africa. And lo and behold, a bunch of South Africans showed up. You know, that happens. They hear about a meeting, they come. And pretty soon it was clear that the white and black South Africans were talking about how much they love their beautiful country. And they shared, there was no question, they shared their love for that beautiful country. And I said, oh my God, what is this that I've heard about South Africans? You know, it's apartheid. But they shared that. And I think part of it is the difficulty, you know, Israeli, Jews, Europeans, and Arab Muslims, there's so many coinciding divisions with very little overarching commonalities, which there were, in Northern Ireland and in South Africa. They're all Christians, so which played a role. They loved their country. It was one country that they wanted. I remember as there was a conference in Jerusalem comparing the South African and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the time that the apartheid had just collapsed. There were white South Africans who were exalted in what they had accomplished with mediation. And I guess somebody's saying, no, there's, the difficulty in South Africa, it was a marriage, it was easier than a divorce, and you're trying to work out a divorce with a two-state solution. And of course, some Palestinian got up and said, there was no marriage, there was rape. And then I thought, put it into that kind of simile. But that is a difference in terms of what you're trying to do. I'm beginning to ramble.
My memory gets worse and worse. I'm trying to think who I was reading a couple of weeks ago who wrote in a book that if you go back to the year 1990 or thereabouts and you asked a lot of people what were the two most intractable conflicts in the world that were not going to be resolved by any kind of conflict resolution intervention, they would have said the Middle East and South Africa. Now, looking back 20 years, which our generation is able to do, you can see how completely wrong they were in one case. And it was not completely unexpected, and it was not necessarily the work due solely to the work that Henry van der Merwe and a whole set of other people had been carrying on for 20 years before that, but they contributed to it. I think what 40-odd years in this game has taught me is that there are ebbs and flows and ups and downs in trying to come to some kind of transformation of an adversarial relationship. And at the moment, this particular situation seems to me to be in a down or at an ebb or something like that, because you've got much closer towards a solution or some kind of a transformation, and it's collapsed around furious. And that's always that's a bad situation to be in. My feeling is that you just have to sort of say, well, we didn't make it the last time. Let's learn from that and let's try again. Now, sometimes this doesn't work. I mean, the thing, I'm the last thing I claim to be is an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian problem. And I do know something about other situations. And the one that breaks my heart, because they got so close to a solution at least 4 times in the last 20 years, is Sri Lanka. I mean, every time they were on the verge of actually coming to some kind of a deal between the leaders of the LTT and the Tamil population and the government in Colombo, it collapsed. Now, and it's collapsed this last time with the apparent complete, total and utter defeat of the LTTE. And I think there are a lot of people in Sri Lanka, a lot of Sinhalese, particularly Sinhalese nationalists, who are going around throwing their arms up in the air saying it's over, it's finished, and we won. Well, I wouldn't like to be in their shoes in 10 years' time, because they haven't resolved that conflict. So, my feeling is that all of the things you've been dancing in the dusk. I don't think you're dancing completely in the dark, but you're doing what all of us do. Carry on dancing, because the next time you will get closer to some kind of a solution. And it may be a temporary, it may be a patch-up solution, it may be something to build on. But that's what you have to do. I mean, if I have one request to all of you who are working in this particular part of the field and in this particular region, is please stop saying it's all in Mitchell's hands. It becomes very embarrassing to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Kreisberg. If any of you are not part of our network, we're very aggressive about social networks. Please give us your email and your Facebook name, and we'd very much like to include you in everything that we do. Thank you.